In the summer of 1996, the BBC aired Gore Vidal's documentary on the history of the American presidents. The History Channel picked up the documentary for distribution in the U.S., but before they had a chance to air it, they took exception to some of the material Vidal presented. In this next segment, you'll hear an extended interview conducted by Radio Nation host Marc Cooper as they discuss how corporate interests affected Vidal's documentary.
After novelist Gore Vidal's three-part series on the history of the American presidency aired on England's Channel 4 television, it was snapped up by the U.S.-based History Channel. That American TV network wisely scheduled Vidal's 3.5 hours to air this summer, right before the national conventions of the two major parties. Everything was going along just fine. Just fine, that is, until the management bureaucrats at the History Channel sat down and actually listened to what Gore Vidal had to say about the institution of America's highest elected office. When Vidal's critique sounded ever more like the uncomfortable truths that our nation's media managers just abhor, they made a strange decision. The History Channel decided that the American people weren't smart enough to be left alone unchaperoned with Vidal, one of our most gifted contemporary writers and a winner of the National Book Award. And so the History Channel took some extraordinary and disturbing measures. There's plenty more left to this story, but who better to tell us the rest than Gore Vidal himself, whose full account of this incident not only appears as a recent cover story in The Nation magazine, but who now joins us live from his residence in Italy. Gore Vidal, thanks for joining us on Radio Nation.
Well, thank you. It was fascinating experience for me to see the 90-minute version that the History Channel put out. They'd been very mysterious for some time. I couldn't get any dates out of them. When are you going to show it and how and so on. And finally I saw it, and then I realized why they were being mysterious. They get what I call two flyweight journalists from the Jurassic age of television.
This is Roger Mudd and Sandy Van Oker, is that right?
That's it, yes. Two flies in amber who've never found a proper place on television, so they have sunk, alas, to the History Channel, thinking in their view. I rather like the idea of the History Channel, but not realizing that it belongs to NBC, which belongs to General Electric, and back of that is the dreaded Disney. They have taken over. I mean, this is a huge conglomerate that controls between the two just about every outlet for television, publishing, and so on. So there I was, Roger Mudd, trembling with righteous wrath at all the things that I had said about American imperialism, which was my subject, the imperial president, how we got our empire.
Right.
Starting with the Louisiana Purchase and descending to George Bush and the Gulf War. And then, just to make sure, he smears the program before it starts. Then at the end of it, he smears me yet again and brings on Mr. Van Oker, who smears me yet again, and he brings on Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., an old friend of mine, and political enemy, and some professor who was obviously out of his mind with excitement at being on television.
Gore, we should back up for a minute and just make it clear. What happened was that the History Channel, and this is the part that I'm not clear, I don't know if they consulted you before or not, it appears they didn't. They took the programs that you did for British television and essentially bracketed them or bookended them with these kind of panels that were meant to, in a way, offset what you had already said on tape. Is that correct?
Exactly. I mean, nothing like it has ever happened that I know of. That here they have a 90-minute program in which I go straight through the presidency and how we got our empire and what we did to get it. And I begin with Roger Mudd attacking me before I get on.
Good heavens.
Then when I finish, he's back again, and then Van Oker's on, and then the two professors are on to say that I'm inaccurate, and so poor Arthur says, and why, he even misquotes the Declaration of Independence. Well, that would sound pretty serious out there. There was a time when every school child knew that.
Used to know.
But I wasn't. Arthur didn't know that I was quoting the original document written by Thomas Jefferson, which Jefferson and I, if I may bracket us, both prefer to the one that Congress published, because it's rather more revealing about the thoughts of Jefferson, a great man, as well as something of an expansionist. So it was really they were pretty desperate to trash anything that I had said. I thought, now, why are they so upset? There's nothing that a student of history doesn't know that I haven't done.
Mm-hmm.
And I suddenly remembered, of course, the damn thing is owned by General Electric, and I have a whole thing on Reagan.
Mm-hmm.
I said, and finally, we got a president. Well, I worked for General Electric now for 17 years. General Electric made him president for 8 years.
Gore Vidal, let me read to our audience exactly what you said about General Electric. The passage from your documentary appears in your article in The Nation. I'm quoting you now, your narration. You say, "Our presidents, now prisoners of security, have been for a generation two-dimensional figures on a screen. In a sense, captives of the empire they created. Essentially, they are men hired to give the commercials for a state which more and more resembles a conglomerate like General Electric. In fact, one of our most popular recent presidents spent nearly 20 years actually doing commercials for General Electric, one of our greatest makers of weapons. Then Mr. Reagan came to work here in the White House, and there was the same Russians are coming dialogue on the same teleprompter and the same makeup men." Do you think it was that swipe at GE that...
I think that a slight chill went through their employees, of which these two journalists were two of them,
Mm-hmm.
and simultaneously through the history departments of the country, which are essentially bureaucratic and jittery, because federal money doesn't go to history departments, but it does go for anything that might have to do with defense, for science.
Mm-hmm.
And they have to, and also the trustees and so on, are very right wing, so they don't dare say anything very sharp about the United States or the empire we've acquired. And that, one of the interesting things that came out of Arthur and the other professor was saying that the United States can't be an empire. I don't know why it can't, but I suppose it's because we are the greatest freedom-loving democracy on earth.
Undoubtedly.
And we wonder then, we are so envied that something called terrorism is now happening to us because people are just mean and spiteful.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't seem to realize what disasters we have made in Southeast Asia, south of the Rio Grande, every corner of the earth. You know, when I was trying to make this program, I went through every embassy, I went through every newspaper file to try and find the American bases all around the world, where they were and how many of them there were. American embassy in London had never heard that there was. Do we have bases? You know, they've got about 24 in England. So I finally, quite recently, I'm afraid after the program, a friend of mine who's a senator got it from the Department of Defense because they have to show where our bases are when they go to Congress asking for money. I've got it. I mean, we are in practically every country on Earth. And the countries that we are not in, we have now FBI, who have all sorts of extraterritorial rights.
DEA.
To arrest drug people.
Yeah.
And naturally to go after terrorism. If we're not a world empire, we are certainly a world extortion racket. And neither one is a good thing. And I said, you know, I end with, I'm standing in front of the Vietnam Memorial. And I said, what a long way we have come from all men are created equal, and in that creation are guaranteed, I forget the exact words, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I said, to have gone from that to the skies over Baghdad have been illuminated, to this. And we end on the Vietnam Memorial. And the professors looked pretty shaken when I was finished. And Van Oker, a certifiable fool, said, well, it's very clear that Gore Vidal doesn't like his country. And I must say Arthur, to give him some credit.
Arthur
said, no, I think
Jr.
he's Arthur Schlesinger. He said, no, I think he's disappointed. Well, Arthur is rioting an understatement. Yes, I'm deeply disappointed. And the whole thrust of it was that we became a militarized economy in 1950, thank you, Harry Truman, national security state, always at war with everybody. No taxpayer has ever got back anything from his tax money. We have no educational system, we have no health care, no jobs of last resort. We get nothing back for our tax money, unlike the rest of the first world countries in Europe, Canada, so on.
Sure.
The money all goes for defense because of the Russians are coming. That went on, and then the Russians viciously gave up and got out of the game. So now we've invented terrorism and drug running. There is nothing coming back to the people at large, and they're very angry.
Gore Vidal,
The reasons they don't vote.
when the History Channel put these talk sessions around the documentary that you produced, did they consult with you first? I don't think it matters very much, but did they ring you up and say, we might have an objection or two? Nothing.
They never spoke to me at all. I had no idea they were doing it. Nor did they make any attempt at balance. A woman from the History Channel talked to somebody at The Nation who was curious about all this. And
Sure.
she said, well, when we realized how opinionated Gore Vidal is,
God forbid.
I love that, opinionated. In other words, there's only to be one opinion, and that's General Electric, Disney, and the Pentagon. We had to have real historians, real experts on. So normally, if you're going to do that, you have somebody who represents my point of view and somebody who represents General Electric and Pentagon point of view. Instead, you get four. I called them the four Mouseketeers. Thank you, Walt Disney, that they came on with sort of symbolic mouse ears representing big business, which, of course, again, you can't say that. We are not an empire, and big business, corporations, and so on do not control our politics.
So these...
I think a child of 9 knows that what I was saying was indeed true.
Well, apparently, these were the 2 points that most angered, most riled these two journalists and these two historians, Slotkin and Schlesinger, who were brought in to, I suppose, from the History Channel's point of view, to balance you. What other...
Well, I'm flattered it takes 4 to 1. And I don't think they did a very good job.
I actually saw the videotape, and it was rather entertaining to see what they tried to do. What did... tell us what other points were they particularly angered about?
Well, I think, obviously, big business is worrisome to say that it has extraordinary powers. And I think the best part of the documentary is I start, as I said at the beginning, and I go straight through the... I do about 8 imperial presidents, those who have added to the empire. And when I got to Woodrow Wilson, I pointed out that Wilson, before we got into the First World War, had occupied Haiti. He had occupied Mexico. American troops had gone in under General Pershing into Veracruz. This is all back in 1914, 15.
Sure.
And in order to bring them freedom and democracy, our usual bull. And I then said, and I think this must have really shaken them, I said a name that you're not supposed ever to tell the American people. The name that you have to be a very advanced history course before you'll ever hear it. Major General Smedley Butler,
U.S.
head of the Marine Corps,
right,
for about 20, 30 years. And I got his own words. He did a memoir in which he blew the whistle on not only President Wilson, but our whole imperial game. And he said, I was a front man, I was an extortionist, I was a hit man for Standard Oil, City Bank of New York. I operated in Haiti, I operated in the Dominican Republic, I operated in Mexico, I operated in Taiwan, I operated in China. Americans don't know that in the interest of Standard Oil, American Marines were all over Shanghai. And then we wonder why the Chinese are sometimes disagreeable with us. We invaded them, and we tried to manage their affairs for them. And he said, and he ends, General Smedley Butler, we had some wonderful footage, too, of Butler and the Marines in Shanghai and on the Great Wall of China. And then I did sort of an imitation of Butler's voice, as I imagined it, and I said, he said, Al Capone had only 3 districts to operate in. I had 3 continents.
Yes.
And made a great apology in later life for what he had done to these countries who were innocent and who were being raped by the American imperialism and big business.
Sure.
Not one of my 4 Mouseketeers on that program made any reference to what I've just said. No reference at all. And there was the proof from a general who had been used, he felt, used and abused.
I want to just remind our listeners that we're speaking with Gore Vidal, and he's author of a recent cover story in The Nation magazine detailing his travails at the History Channel here in the United States, where they took a three-part documentary that Gore Vidal produced and narrated for Channel 4 in England on the imperial presidency, and they decided that the History Channel decided Americans weren't smart enough to just hear that unfiltered, and they bracketed it with a panel of four so-called experts, 2 journalists and 2 historians, to really undermine what was in the rest of the show. Gore, what about the state of the American presidency as we speak today? Let's just shift to real history and away from the History Channel. Is it any worse now than it was 20 years ago, 40 years ago? Is there any... Are we continuing into a deep slide, or are we just sort of in the trough?
Oh, no. What's wrong is systemic. It's not cyclic, as they say in the economy. And if it's in the system, you're not going to correct it. The entire thing now is money, and he who raises the most money to buy the most time on television is apt to become the president. And at the moment, Clinton is playing the usual game and raising an awful lot of money, so is Dole. And that's really all there is to it. Now, where does the money come from? Well, the interesting background, at least, and certainly for the Nation, because the Nation did a story, a month or so ago, about the conglomerates, that there are about 5 of them, now own practically all the media in the United States, publishing houses, newspapers, radio, television, cable. They own it. They control it. And what they did to me was precisely what everybody had feared they would do. Where they made a mistake was to run my program at all.
Sure.
Normally, they should have killed it. Instead, they thought they could overcome me with hiring 4 of their apologists. And it didn't work. Now, on a larger scale, the politics of today is just that, on a much bigger scale than what I experienced. Clinton cannot say or do anything that might offend the great ownership of the country. That is the 1% that owns the United States. They have something like 77% of the revenues of the country go to them. There's something like 20% that has no money of any kind. It really boils down to about this, and this is what Clinton is appealing to and Dole, because the only people who vote, really, are the 20% who are doing quite well, 1 in 5, and they work for the 1%. And they end up in the Congress, they end up in the courts, they're judges, they're stockbrokers, bankers. They're the guys with the jobs, they're the mandarins who work for the emperors, and the emperors are the ones who own the conglomerates and the principal stockholders. And is it a conspiracy? Immediately I can just hear Arthur squeezing on that one. No, it's not a conspiracy. They all think alike. Money does tend to think like other money. And so you have basically a country controlled by 1% of the population, with something like 20% more or less working for it, either directly, let's say running the New York Times, or indeed being president of the United States. That's one of the jobs within their gift. What happened to the Clintons, and it again is almost as a better example than what happened to me. They go in starry-eyed, and they want to give the American people something the American people want, which is a national health service, which every civilized country with money, all of Western Europe, Canada, and so on, they have it.
Sure.
Americans can't have it, because their tax money must go always for war. The Russians are coming. Well, they did their best, and the Clintons, and they hadn't figured out that they had taken on the ruling class of their country. This is where being from Little Rock isn't a great help. They didn't know about this. Hartford Life Insurance and the other insurance companies take something like 30% of everything that is paid for medically in the United States under our present mess. Well, you can only have a single-payer service for the people at large if you eliminate the insurance companies.
Sure.
Well, they're not about to liquidate themselves. Well, they should have taken on, this is hindsight, but the Clintons should have taken on at the beginning, just say, look, we're going to take on the insurance companies. Everybody on earth hates them anyway. But it's not that easy. Hartford Life was bought some years ago by ITT, which is one of the really great corporations, and it's international. I remember one year I was investigating ITT, it was about 15 years ago. They paid no tax in the United States on revenues of $2-3 billion, whatever it was, dollars. They don't pay any tax. They don't live anywhere. They have no forwarding address. They're all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
They live back of the internet. They have a condo there. So they pay no taxes, so there's no tax revenue from them, but they do own Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And the Clintons were suddenly faced with that. You can't have a head-on battle with these people, because if you did, you would win it. You'd say, look, we have to have this service. People want this service.
Sure.
And we're sorry that you're not going to have such great revenues, but the people will be served. Instead, they spent $500 million smearing the Clintons.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't just smear you on the issue, this is a communist program. I mean, they did a lot of that. You can't have your doctor, or whatever. All this stuff that comes out about Whitewater and Hillary murdering her lover and this nonsense that keeps coming out, this is all coming from these people. They have the money to smear anybody.
Mm-hmm. Gore Vidal, this great democratic spirit that imbued at least that original draft of Jefferson's Declaration of Independence that you quoted on your program on the History Channel, do you see any of that spirit still alive anywhere in any pocket of America, or do you think it's just relegated to the history books?
I think it's, you see, one of the brilliant things that was done, I like to think it was inadvertent, as I'm not a conspiracy theory man in principle,
Mm-hmm.
was to stop educating the American people around 1950. And that was the year that Harry Truman turned us into a garrison state, a totally militarized economy. At about that time, the schools started, we had quite a good public educational system before that, it started to fall apart. The people at large have no information, they can't read or write with any great ease. The children of the 20%, the mandarins who serve the 1%, they go to very good schools, they get good educations. And they know where their bread and butter lies, and they will never question the system. To listen to those two professors on the program, I mean, you really heard the voice of the ownership.
Mm-hmm.
These were like a pair of shill lawyers who had been hired to make a case for the guys who were poisoning the river for their chemical company. And they were going to think of anything they could to try and turn the case around. No, I don't see... There are individuals around the country who will speak out, but let's say you got a Huey Long without his demerits and all of his merits, and he was a great figure, and for the people at large. But Huey Long came along today, well, he'd probably have been shot like the original Huey, but
exactly.
He wouldn't get in the Times,
Mm-hmm.
or he'd be treated as a joke.
Mm-hmm.
If he somehow got to be governor of Louisiana like the original one, well, he'd be covered as a sideshow,
Mm-hmm.
which they tried to do with the original Huey, who outdid them. He was better at radio, which was the big thing in those days. Huey got to the people. They were so terrified in 36 that if he went in with a separate party, it would destroy the Democrats, and Huey had a chance even of winning. And then he's mysteriously shot down in the state capitol at Baton Rouge,
Mm-hmm.
as so often happens. Now you don't have to shoot him down. The media does it. And now that the media is so concentrated in the hands of so few corporations and so few people running everything, all of like mind, and between keeping a Huey Long from being heard, keeping the Clintons from a health program, and keeping me from telling the people about General Smedley Butler and our occupation of Shanghai and in the 20s, this is a very tightly censored and tightly controlled country by, I think, the most intelligent ruling class that I've ever come across anywhere in history.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody knows they exist. They hire the Schlesingers and so on to tell college students, oh no, this is a meritocracy. Anybody can be president. Look at Clinton, he's anybody. Anybody can be head of General Motors, yes, but who owns it?
Mm-hmm.
I once pointed that out to one of these great figures, professors, and he said, why, the head of DuPont isn't a DuPont, it's somebody from the Harvard Business School. I said, yeah, and I had lunch with Nelson Rockefeller once at his house, and do you know he didn't cook the lunch?
So, not feeling very optimistic.
No.
Mm-hmm.
You only get great change when you have great crisis.
Mm-hmm.
I assume that the economy is going to go crashing
Mm-hmm.
in the next 5, 10, 20 years, and I suspect there'll be a period of chaos. Nobody can guess what will come.
Sure.
If you're an optimist, you might think we could go back, say, to Philadelphia and make a new constitution, or try and revive the old one.
Mm-hmm.
That would have to be a conscious movement, and people would have to know what they were doing, so you would need at least an educated elite. I think what's going to happen, more likely, will be the inner cities will erupt and be unlivable. I can then see people, law and order, terrorism. One of the reasons that's so important to them, they can lock up anybody any time, which is the idea behind it.
Sure.
I think at some point the Pentagon will come in with a committee of public safety, and the people will be, we're safe at last.
Relieved.
Of course, there'll be curfews. You can't go out, and you have a police state in which you have no liberty, which we are gliding toward right now. The terrorist bill is an all-out assault on the Bill of Rights, but so is practically all the legislation of the last 20 years. Do I see that turning around? No. Who's going to turn it around? We get back to this thing of media. There's no media even if you were the greatest salesman and the greatest demagogue and your voice was totally convincing, you're not going to be on television. You're not going to be on radio. Maybe Pacifica will have you on, but you're never going to reach the people who should hear you. Noam Chomsky and I have both been pretty much eliminated as voices, political voices, by the main media. Yet both Chomsky and I, we're sort of in the same wavelength. Either one of us goes on a campus, we can get 5,000, 10,000 people, even though all our flyers that they put up on the walls are torn down. In my case, within about 20 minutes, putting them up. Mm-hmm. They'll come. The word spreads. So there is dissatisfaction, and there is a very interested group, but you'll have to do it like that. You will never be able to get to them through the media.
That was an interview with Gore Vidal by Radio Nation host Marc Cooper, conducted in November of 1996. This has been part 3 of Voices of Pacifica, a 3-part series on one of America's greatest writers and political commentators, Gore Vidal.